and use that knowledge for the betterment of us here in Ohio. And Robert, of course, has done that himself. He served, I think it was the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals under Judge Batchelder. He taught constitutional law at Ashland University. He taught securities law at Case Western Reserve University. He served for a number of years as a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He is also currently associated with the Ashbrook Institute at Ashland University, as well as working for the Buckeye Institute. He's a commentator on Fox News. He's been on CNN. He's been on PBS. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times. He also writes voraciously for National Review, and he's been on a lot of radio stations. And so, oh, by the way, he was also a war correspondent in Iraq. So it was with great joy. I'm really pleased to have him here. I welcome Robert Alt.
Well, thank you, Doug, for an overly kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to see all of you out here today. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. See, as a recovering law professor, you know, being loud enough generally isn't one of my problems. So as Doug suggested, I'm the president of the Buckeye Institute, and we look to find data-driven solutions to the most pressing problems facing Ohio. I want to tell you a little bit about what we've been working on probably the most in recent days, and that's looking at the biennial budget, and particularly looking at the question of Medicaid expansion. I thought I'd focus predominantly on that here this evening. And we can perhaps wander from that if you have other questions in Q&A. But so before we sort of dive into that, let's take a step back. Why is it that we're considering the question of expanding Medicaid? Why do we even have the question of whether to expand Medicaid? And the answer to that question is because Ohio sued. Most people sort of forget about that. Ohio sued the federal government and said that what the federal government was trying to do in ObamaCare was unlawful and coercive with regard to expanding the Medicaid program. The Medicaid program under ObamaCare, the federal government said that we had to expand it to 138% of the federal poverty level. We had to transform the Medicaid program from what it had always been. Medicaid traditionally in Ohio today covers pregnant women, it covers parents with children, it covers the disabled, and it covers the elderly. But it never covered able-bodied adults without children, without disabilities. And under Obamacare, Medicaid was transformed into a general welfare program, vastly increasing the number of individuals covered. And so Ohio said, look, we didn't sign up for this when we signed up to participate in Medicaid originally. This is going to be a very different program and a much more costly program. To which the federal government said, well, you don't have to participate in it, but you'll lose your first dollar of Medicaid funding. I mean, pause and think about that for just a moment. What are we talking about with that? Currently, Medicaid takes up about 30% of Ohio's state budget. So if in fact we went ahead and sacrificed that, that would be devastating to the state. And the Supreme Court actually agreed. They found that the states, there were many other states in a similar situation to Ohio, but they were functionally negotiating with a gun to their head with regard to this question, to go ahead and participate in the expansion or face devastating consequences financially. But the federal government, in fact, argued, well, no, this is a great deal. It's such a great deal, no one could possibly pass it up. And interestingly enough, Ohio, through its lawyer, walked into court and said, no, it's not a great deal. It in fact, is a deal that's problematic. It has too many strings attached. It's going to change this. There's no personal responsibility for the program. You know, there's any number of reasons that states wouldn't want to be coerced into participating in this. And the court agreed. They found, in fact, that it was coercive and that states might, in fact, want not to participate. And so ironically, after all of that, after this hard-fought victory, Ohio is now in the position in which the administration has suggested that we should, in fact, voluntarily expand Medicaid, to accept the offer that we fought so diligently in court not to be forced to take. And so I would argue, one, that the arguments that Ohio made in court are still very valid today. It's not that great a deal. And so I'd like to pause and chat with you a little bit this evening about that and why it is that expanding Medicaid is actually the wrong decision for Ohio. So first of all, financially, it looks great on paper at first. After all, the federal government pays 100% of the premium cost for the first 3 years, then phases down to 90%. That's a pretty good deal. And I think that that's motivating a number of folks who have been supporting it. It's free money, after all. We all know how great free money is. You know, perhaps it would have done folks looking at this well to have gone back and read what the Supreme Court said in the case, why it is that the free money maybe isn't such a good deal. 7 justices, spanning from the left to the right, joined opinion acknowledging the very real possibility that the federal government could at any time in the future modify the terms of the agreement in such a way as to substantially stick the states with a larger portion of the bill. And that fundamentally there's nothing the states could do about it then. And in fact, as if almost to agree with the court, the Obama administration in their fiscal year 2013 proposed budget suggested a minor tweak in the match rate, just a small tweak, would have cost Ohio $2 billion in the next 5 years. Now, they backed off from it, and people are very quick to say, oh, but they backed off. And I was actually looking, in the document where they announced it, they said, quite frankly, the Supreme Court's decision makes it far more necessary to maintain the match rates in order to induce the states to participate. They actually use the word induce. This is government by drug dealer. The first hit is free. The next one's going to cost you. And those who think that the federal government isn't going to modify the match rates at some point in the future just need to look at the federal government's own projections on spending for Medicaid. Between 2014 and 2022, they estimate they're going to be spending over $3 trillion on Medicaid from the federal coffers alone. We're $16.5 trillion in debt to begin with. And at this point, folks, in both parties, as we've been talking about these these cyclical negotiations on debt, have acknowledged that some modification to the entitlement programs is going to be necessary as part of the conversation. It's really not a question of if the federal government will modify the rates it's paying, it's only a question of when. And keep in mind the statistic I gave you already. 30% of our state budget is already spent on Medicaid. If they tweak it, it's $2 billion more. This could be absolutely devastating to Ohio. So those who are talking about this in terms of, well, we should take the easy money up front, it will help us with some of our current fiscal issues in terms of costs that ObamaCare is shifting upon us, it will help us to fund tax cuts. Just keep in mind that those tax cuts will more than be eaten up with the potential long-term liabilities that Ohio is signing on the bottom line to. In that sense, I've chatted, folks in this room may appreciate, to my mind, the short-term, long-term on this, it's sort of like when you go in to get a mortgage and you're given the option of getting, the good fixed rate term, or that you get a very attractive, APR rate tossed at you, and those who suggest, well, it's not for certain that it's going to raise in the future, that the federal government's going to change the rate. It's the same thing with the APR, but most people look at that and say, well, I remember what the rate of inflation was when Carter was in office. I remember my dad getting getting a mortgage at around 18%, I think, at one point, which, you know, most of us would decline a credit card offer if it had that kind of rate these days. But, you know, once again, if you take that bargain, you're locked in. If Ohio takes the bargain with regard to the Medicaid expansion, the federal government can modify it in the future, and we're locked in to those terms. The other thing, you know, when you're chatting with folks, a lot of them will talk about the 100% to 90%. Sort of a wonky little detail I like to point out is they don't talk about administrative costs. No one talks about that. These studies that look at it, they pretend they don't exist, but they do. And the federal government doesn't pick up as large a percentage of the administrative costs, which are going to be about $12 billion for the states just during the implementation period that we're talking about. For Ohio, we've estimated conservatively that you're talking about 137 million just for that alone as well. So why is it that we would go ahead and spend all this money on this program? Well, we've been told we really need to do it out of concern for the individuals who don't have insurance. And that would be a good argument if, in fact, Medicaid were good for the recipients. And there's a couple of reasons why it's not. One generally and one specifically. The general reason is, oddly enough, study after study after study has shown that individuals on Medicaid have worse health outcomes, apples for apples. So we take a look, you know, there was a study by the University of Virginia, for instance, looked at 900,000 major procedures, and it compared them by procedure, health outcome. And you were 13% more likely to die if you had Medicaid than if you had, not if you had insurance, but if you had no insurance at all. Your health outcomes were poor if you had Medicaid than if you had no insurance at all. In numerous procedures. They looked at cancers, various forms of cancer, they looked at organ transplants, serious things. So those who say, well, no, these are sick, these are Medicaid recipients are sick and they're going into the emergency room and you can't sort of look at that. Well, no, you're comparing it to charity care. So those individuals are in the same boat. Why is it that it's so poor? A number of reasons, among them, Medicaid is a really poorly run program, and a lot of the better doctors simply don't take Medicaid. The administrative requirements are so onerous with regard to billing, for instance, and if you make a mistake, you risk being thrown in the pokey for accounting errors. The payment rates that they pay are the lowest in the industry, so it's just, quite frankly, not worth a lot of doctors' time to take it. And so, in fact, you end up channeling individuals into poor quality care. The other response I've heard from in some sectors is that Ohio runs its program differently because we have managed care. Well, neither the laws of physics nor mathematics nor statistics end at the four corners of Ohio, and 71% of all Medicaid recipients in the United States are in managed care plans. So, for instance, when you look at a study from UVA that looks at 900,000 procedures, that included Ohio, and it included managed care plans. So the claim that somehow we're different than everyone else, again, we're actually very similar to many other states with regard to how these programs are run, and we're similar to those that were studied in these studies. Which raises the question, why is it that Ohioans should spend billions of dollars to make its citizens worse off than if we hadn't spent the money to begin with? But there's a second reason why this isn't necessarily as generous to the recipients as you might think, and it goes to the nature of the population in question. Keep in mind, once again, who are we expanding Medicaid to cover? Because I think oftentimes when you hear people talk about it, you get the picture of the single mom struggling to get by, you get the picture of the family trying to fight. Those are not the people who we're talking about. Because again, the single mom is already eligible for Medicaid in these income brackets. The pregnant mom is already eligible for Medicaid in these income brackets. The disabled individual is already eligible for Medicaid in these income brackets. The elderly is already eligible for Medicaid in these income brackets. Who is it that we're talking about? We're talking about single, able-bodied individuals who are not disabled, who do not have children, who are not pregnant, and who are not elderly. So, and we're talking about giving them a health care benefit with no personal responsibility requirement fixed to it whatsoever. We're going back to sort of the pre-welfare reform days and providing a permanent benefit. And in conversations I've had with some individuals, they're rather incredulous to the idea that doing so will have any effect on the propensity of these individuals to work. But we had that debate back in the 90s, and we had people tell us that if you reform welfare, there's no one who would not work and receive welfare instead. And then we saw when we put the work requirements in that in fact many people did get off the welfare rolls and go into work. And the goal that we should be having for these individuals is to make them productive members of society and get them to where they're able to either purchase insurance products on the market, or whether might be able to get it from an employer, or possibly even be getting it from the exchanges which will be set up. But we shouldn't be trying to trap them into a perpetual entitlement program, which is what this does. And it doesn't take much, actually, to shift the individuals to a level where they would no longer need Medicaid. Keep in mind, whether we do anything or not, under the federal exchange program that's being set up under ObamaCare, people from 100% to 400% of the poverty line will get subsidies in the federal exchanges. So once you're over 100% of the federal poverty line, at that point you no longer would need the Medicaid coverage. In order to get coverage, you'd be able to get coverage elsewhere subsidized. So what does that mean for an Ohioan? Well, based upon Ohio's minimum wage law, you could work 30 hours a week for 50 weeks a year, and you would, with a minimum wage job, and you would exceed the federal poverty level. Or you could work 40 hours a week for 36 weeks a year with a minimum wage job, and you would be over the federal poverty level. What we need to do is create incentives to get these individuals into jobs, not provide them with a safety net that begins to look like a hammock. And it also goes to some of the unique problems facing these populations. So some of these individuals are just, sort of young folks starting off in life who are genuinely healthy and probably don't have sort of high needs for healthcare. But some aren't. Some have serious chemical dependency issues, and some have mental health issues. But again, Medicaid is not well equipped to take care of these folks either. That's not what the program was set up to do. It would be far better if that's the concern. We could take a look. Ohio gets block grant funds for that. We could focus and target programs to address those concerns of these individuals, rather than using the one-size-fits-all program that is Medicaid. The problem that we have is by opting into the expansion, Ohio has very little leverage with regard to how it fashions the program, whether in terms of instilling personal responsibility or requiring personal responsibility, or addressing some of these more serious chemical dependency and mental health issues that may arise. Which raises, let's take a look at a couple of the potential objections that have been said. One is, well, we're in the process of negotiating with the federal government in order to get greater flexibility in how we handle the plan. We've had conversations with Valerie Jarrett, after all. And I'm sure they've been quite pleasant. But what is it that we can count on from this? Well, there's a couple of ways that they could potentially get this flexibility. One way they could get it is to get a waiver from the program. So we sign on the dotted line, which is again what the Obama administration really wants that, because in fact the system doesn't work well. All the projections were based upon the idea that all 50 states would sign on, and so some of the issues with the exchange, the coverage levels, and so forth are somewhat interconnected. So having more states out of the system is problematic. So they want us to sign on the dotted line. So what if they give us a waiver and say, well, you can have personal responsibility, you can make them have co-pays, you might be able to put work requirements in, we'll give you all kinds of things that you want and to allow you to run the program. Well, the problem is any waiver under federal law with regard to these is temporary. Most of them last about 3 years, but they can't be permanent. And so it becomes a perpetual game of Mother May I. We go ahead and get the permission this time, but in 3 years, when our permission slip is no longer valid and we go to it, it may not even be the same secretary. It could be at some point down the road a different administration, and at some point they can simply say no. And at that point, again, we're stuck in perpetuity holding the bag for whatever the program is, even if it's not being run in the way that we would like it to be run. The other way that they've talked about doing it is somehow changing it up front, that we take the money and be able to use that to buy in. This is the Arkansas model. We'd be able to use the money to buy in to the exchange, individuals into the exchanges. No one sort of has put this on paper yet because it probably violates federal law. But the Obama administration isn't bothered by such niceties. But traditionally, in order to do that, it has to meet a cost-effectiveness requirement, which means it has to be at least as cheap as Medicaid. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that buying people insurance in exchanges will cost about 15% more. So remember what I was telling you about in terms of all that increased spending, both for the federal government and for the state government. Well, essentially what you do in this case, if you're putting them on the exchange, buying them onto the exchanges, is as you're approaching the cliff, you hit the accelerator. And so Ohio's share is now 50% higher. The federal government share is now 50% higher, all the way along. And so that doesn't, for those of us who are concerned about the fiscal issues, that doesn't seem to be a great solution to the problem necessarily as well. And additionally, if that weren't bad enough, all the general requirements of Medicaid, you've signed on to the expansion, then they still apply. You're still bound for the length of the program. That Greg Moody, who's in charge of the Medicaid programs for Ohio, conceded that if it became too costly, we would just shift folks back into Medicaid, which just goes to how it is the program will be run. Ultimately, you could call it something else, but it's still the Medicaid expansion. It still has all the sort of strings attached to it. If it becomes too costly, we don't have an option of getting out. We just shift it back into Medicaid. But that goes to the question of, well, but they're going to put a circuit breaker in, fail-safe. There are different names for it. And so if the federal government ever changes the rates in any way, Ohio is out. We'll make it even automatic, so Ohio gets out automatically. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. One is that it's illegal. And in this case, since it benefits the federal government, they might actually be concerned about that. The Supreme Court, in the case, which gave, taking us back to where we began, when the Supreme Court considered the question that Ohio took before them of, can we be coerced with that first dollar of spending, of Medicaid spending, to opt into the expansion? The Supreme Court said no. You cannot be coerced to participate in the program. But it didn't say that once you participate in the program, that the ordinary requirements of the law won't apply. In fact, part of the reason that they said you couldn't be coerced to this expansion is they agreed with Ohio that it was a fundamental transformation of what Medicaid had ever been, and that it would have been too much of a shot from the dark. There's no way Ohio could have anticipated this when they signed up for Medicaid, that it was going to change in this way. And so because of that, because this was so outside the contract, they treat them as contracts essentially, that Ohio had signed up for and couldn't have been anticipated, they weren't going to hold Ohio to the deal. In this case, however, the Supreme Court said in the opinion, 7 justices in 2 opinions, it's highly likely that the federal government could modify the rates and shoulder the states with a greater burden. So if in fact the federal government modifies the rates and Ohio comes marching into court a second time, the court isn't going to say, well, there's no way you could have anticipated it. The court is far more likely to say, we warned you about this. So in terms of that, there's nothing in the Supreme Court's opinion that suggests that the law as it's written would not apply. And the law, as it is written, gives the secretary the discretion to withhold first dollar of funding if you don't comply with the program. The expanded group becomes a mandatory group to be covered, and any change to it risks that funding. So if you hear anyone say that, well, we can just get out, that's legally erroneous. But even if it weren't legally erroneous, how often have you seen governments shrink entitlement programs by hundreds of thousands of individuals overnight? Even if they claim it's going to happen automatically, do you really believe that, that it's going to be treated like that? I mean, we live in a society where we're battling over cuts that are reduction in increases. So do we really think that, that if in fact the federal government changed it 1%, changed the match rate 1%, and we knocked all those people off, that there wouldn't be a move to reinstate it before it even took effect? I find it difficult to believe that such a scenario would come to pass, that the legislature and or the governor, whoever it could be at that point, would just let that happen. So I don't consider that to be politically realistic, and I don't consider it to be legally accurate to say that we would be able to get out at some point. But which leads us to the question, well, but it's our money. If in fact we don't take this money back, we're shipping Ohio's money off to other states, Ohio taxpayer money off. And on this point, I guess the big argument is, this is an area where it's not a fixed pool. Let me give you an area where it was a fixed pool. High-speed rail. In high-speed rail, there was a limited set fixed number of dollars that the federal government had set aside for high-speed rail projects. Ohio won the bid for one of these projects, and if in fact Ohio didn't take the money, which we didn't, that money actually went someplace else. We didn't save the federal government any money, it just actually literally went to California. With regard to Medicaid, if we don't expand the program, that money never gets spent. It's not like there's some magical pot of money out there. They've got no money set aside. They've just got a really big credit card that they keep on stacking money on. And this just means that in fact Ohio will not be stacking more money on that bill. Additionally, hopefully, other states will follow the lead and say, gee, Ohio said no, maybe we could say no too. The more states that don't participate, the smaller the bill is, the less everyone's tax obligations are. So this is not really a situation in which we need to take this, because otherwise it's not a fixed pool. It's not a fixed pool. Additionally, if you're looking to save Ohio taxpayers money, in the long run, again, when these bills come due and when we are faced with the question of how it is we're going to pay for it, very likely we're going to have to raise Ohioans' taxes to pay for it, or slash spending, or more likely both, in order to do so. So if we're really worried about making sure that Ohio's money stays in Ohio, how can we be worried about keeping it in the taxpayers' pockets to begin with? And by not expanding, they'd be able to do that. Now, we can talk about, I'll leave that there. We can talk in Q&A about how it is, if we wanted to actually provide coverage for the people from 0 to 100, there are ways that Ohio could do it. And I'll just preview that a little bit now. Right now, for instance, the federal Medicaid program the federal state Medicaid program that Ohio participates in covers more people than the federal government requires. We have optional groups in there. And the optional groups, because of the way ObamaCare is structured, could actually get coverage on the exchange if we simply reduce our coverage levels. If we do that, Ohio saves in one fell swoop about just shy of $250 million a year. We get another $66 million in block grants for mental health. We've got some other funds that we get from taxes with regard to uncompensated care. So we've got a pool of funds that's actually pretty reasonable that we could work with to provide a very sort of limited benefit for individuals that could have some of the features that we've talked about. It could require personal responsibility. You either have a job, you're looking for a job, you're in a job training program, you're in an education program in order to participate in it. It would provide sort of limited benefits, but it could provide targeted benefits for chemical dependency and or mental health issues. We could actually tailor a program to fit Ohio's needs if we wanted to provide these services on a state-run basis for these populations. But we would have much greater flexibility in how it is we did it, and we'd have control over the budget, which is the big issue. It would not be something where the federal government could dictate to us in the future how to handle it. So if we're looking to do that, if our goal is to cover these populations, there are better ways to do it than supporting a big, failing federal government program that actually makes people worse off in terms of health outcomes than they would be if they had no insurance at all. So with that, let me go ahead and pause, and I'll take any questions you all may have. Yes, ma'am.
I heard a lot about these exchanges this evening and prior to coming here. Who administers that? I saw something on the TV the other day, 15 pages of application to become part of it, which would require help for people, et cetera, et cetera. Would you like to explain a little bit about this exchange thing and whether it's administered and so forth?
The exchange in Ohio would be administered by the federal government. Ohio was given a choice, and the Kasich administration made the right choice, because unfortunately the exchanges, we hear the term exchanges, and sometimes I think we have in mind a probably more positive view than what they would be. We have in mind free market exchanges, where you can purchase different insurance products that actually fit your need and provide different levels of coverage. But in fact, we don't, ObamaCare doesn't permit such silly things. We believe in one size fits all and cross subsidization, because in fact, if you're young and healthy, you'd probably get a health plan that was very basic and covered young and healthy people. But then you wouldn't be cross-subsidizing other groups, and that's really sort of what's at stake here. We want to make sure that everyone has, they call them, sort of the bronze, gold, and I forget if it's gold, silver, bronze, or if it's platinum, gold, silver plans, but they're all pretty platinum, quite frankly, in terms of the levels of coverage, and which will actually drive a number of plans that would be better for individuals out of the system. So because in part there's not the flexibility in how the insurance exchanges are run, and because it would have costed Ohio a substantial amount to run these programs, Kasich wisely said, thanks but no thanks. If you guys want to have an exchange, you can run it yourselves. So the federal government will be running the exchanges for these insurance programs. And in terms of how it is they operate, in addition to other things, at least as it's set up in the law, and there's a couple of open questions, there's some lawsuits over this, they're supposed to provide subsidies for people between 100 and 400% of the federal poverty level. So that's just sort of exchanges in a nutshell.
I'm moving up because I want to hear your answer. I don't know closer. I'm confused about the governor, because I was very encouraged when the governor decided to say that we in Ohio were not going to create an exchange. I thought, well, the governor is really on the side of conservative thinkers. And then as it rolled out and rolled out and rolled out, I was very surprised that the governor decided that he was going to go ahead and take the Medicaid funds. And with what you just said, and I couldn't hear everything in the back, but one of the things that seemed very clear was, if we don't take it, it's not spent, it's not going somewhere else. So that leaves me further confused, because my thought was, well, he's taking it because he doesn't want our federal tax dollars to go to 39 other states. So what's your assessment of why you stood in a very conservative position on the exchange issue and a very confusing, to me, position on the Medicaid issue?
Well, I'll try and do. I mean, you know, for the most part, I can only tell you what he said and try and parse some things from that. I mean, one, I do know that he's been very concerned about the increase in costs that will be shifted to Ohio because of ObamaCare. I mean, one of the big questions is the so-called woodworking effect.
The what?
The so-called woodworking effect. I'll try and bellow a bit more. Right now, you've got folks who are eligible for Medicaid, but who haven't signed up for the program for one reason or another. The problem now in 2014, again, the mandate kicks in. Now the Supreme Court again has made it clear it's not really a mandate; it's a tax. And we can talk about such mental gymnastics at some point in the future, but a lot of people are going to view it as a requirement. Even people who it really doesn't apply to. For instance, I mean, a lot of the folks, you know, in this category of lower income, if you don't pay income tax, then if you don't file a federal income tax form, then you're not subject to the tax. So a lot of these folks wouldn't have been subject to it, period. But they still may feel obligated because there'll probably be plenty of public service announcements put out there about you need to sign up, it's the law, blah, 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 you know, kind of thing. And so folks will end up signing up who haven't. So they estimate that there's going to be an increase in the cost of the existing program. And we don't get either way, we don't get more of a match rate for those folks in any event. But it's going to cost Ohio more money. And so I know the governor was concerned about trying to come up with that money. And his advisors looked at a number of things and they said, for instance, well, you know, we actually tax Medicaid managed care. We don't tax all managed care, but we tax Medicaid managed care with a sales tax. And it's sort of a tricky thing that we do in order to meet our matching funds obligations. So we tax them and then we pay it back, but it helps increase our match rate for the federal government. So we're basically taxing tax dollars in order to get more federal tax dollars. If you're confused, so am I. But trust me, that's
No,
actually...
we're not confused at all, actually.
That's actually how it works. And so what they said is, you know what? If in fact we have more people on Medicaid, then we'll make a lot more money on the sales tax. And that'll help to cover this.
I think you just completely answered my question.
Now, the problem with this, by the way, is that the Obama administration was wise. First of all, we've only had this sales tax for a little while. The reason that we only have had this sales tax for a little while is the federal government prohibited us from doing the previous tax that we had on it. So we switched to the sales tax. Only a couple of states have. Michigan had it. They got rid of it, in part out of concerns that it was going to go the way of the wildebeest. And in fact, Obama's OMB recently suggested slashing the amount, the maximum that the state could charge. So a lot of the revenue estimates he's relying on, the federal government, again, as they're looking for ways to cut entitlement spending, this is an easy one because they can go ahead and prohibit the states from taxing this in this way, and that means that that's less money they have to match in the future. So when we're having these entitlement discussions, it's an easy loophole to close, and they've already suggested at least limiting it, maxing it out at 3.5% among other things. But so part of it is you know, I think they're seeking to rely on these faulty revenue estimates in order to try and pay for some of the costs that are going to be put upon the state by Obamacare. But at the end of the day, they're taking the big problem is it's short-sighted because it takes short-term money, it takes the free money, remember that great free money, it takes the free money, but it exchanges it in the long term for real substantial liabilities for the state. So, and then again, it's a real problem with Obamacare in all the states, is it's front-loaded in such a way that all the goodies come up front and all the pain comes later. And particularly when you're dealing, you know, sort of in the reality of so many states with term-limited politicians, they're all going to be gone by the time the pain comes. But you're still going to be here, paying taxes for what they've potentially put in place. The other reason I think that Kasich actually did just, you know, is I think he actually does have genuine concern about folks, but in that 0 to 100% bracket, But I think that, again, that's somewhat misguided given what I told you about the health outcomes. There are better ways, if you really wanted to do something there are better ways to do it than spending billions on a failing program. So.
Have you been asked what would it take to replace Medicaid in the state of Ohio?
I haven't been asked from a soup to nuts, but
Can you repeat the question?
Doug asked, have I been asked what it would take to replace Medicaid in Ohio? And there have been some legislators who have actually considered replacing it wholesale for the whole program. I think most of them realize that that's probably too much. I have had some conversation with folks about what could be done for this smaller segment of the population. You know, this is 0 to 100 able-bodied group, and that's something that we've tried to work with them, because for a number of the legislators, there's a sense that they don't want to be in a position of simply saying no. They want to have an alternative, and I think again there are alternatives out there which would be better than Medicaid. And in fact, given the health outcomes, it's hard to think of things that wouldn't be.
Can you explain or expand upon what happened in the state of Florida in regards to the governor wanting to embrace the program? Was it the legislature that mixed in? Do you have any knowledge of that?
Well, again, Governor Scott proposed expanding. The legislature pushed back. I think right now there's still negotiations. I'm actually supposed to be on a conference call with some folks here later, I think this week or early next week. They're kind of in a similar situation. They're trying to see if there are alternatives that can be put in place instead of going down the path of Medicaid expansion. So Buckeye is actually coordinating with think tanks across the country on looking at what sort of more creative solutions, preferably more free market solutions to the extent that free market is still legal after ObamaCare, but could be promoted instead of expansion. But I know the Florida legislature is looking at other options, but at least at this point it has stalled the move toward expansion. And I know Governor Perry came out late last week as well and clarified his position that he's against expansion for Texas, and he's seeking to put pressure on the federal government to give states more authority in terms of block grants for funds. But that obviously will require Congress and the president to ultimately agree to a program of that sort.
What can we do in Ohio to stall it like we stalled in Florida? Because to be sure, this has nothing to do with covering people or improving medicine. The entire purpose of ObamaCare is to make more people wards of the state and therefore Democratic Party voters. So, I don't know how many action items you can take. I don't Representative Bielski, does anyone know where she stands, what she's going to do? She represents this area, right?
Well, in terms of that, I think again, and I have to be somewhat careful with regard to this because as a C3 organization.